Have you ever noticed that you only feel crazy around one specific person? Have you ever asked yourself why your anxiety disappears the moment they leave the room? Why your chest loosens when their voice isn't around? Why you can breathe again when you're alone? If you were really the problem, would peace feel like this when they're gone? What if your breakdown wasn't proof that you were unstable, but proof that something around you was? And what if the moment you started to feel slightly better was the moment everything quietly began to change? She didn't wake up one morning feeling strong. She didn't suddenly feel empowered, confident, or free. What she felt was unfamiliar, quiet. Not the heavy silence that follows a fight. Not the tense quiet where you're waiting for the next emotional hit. This was different. This was the kind of quiet where nothing inside her was bracing for impact. It startled her. For so long, her body had been used to living on edge, listening for footsteps, decoding tone, preparing explanations before they were even asked for. Her nervous system had learned to stay alert, to never fully rest. And now, lying alone in bed, staring at the ceiling, she noticed something strange. Her heart wasn't racing. That realization came with confusion, not relief. Because when you've lived in survival mode long enough, calm doesn't feel safe. Calm feels suspicious. Calm feels like the moment right before something goes wrong. She waited for the familiar tightness in her chest. It didn't come. She replayed the argument from days before, the shouting, the tears, the look on his face when she broke. Normally, her mind would spiral at this point, dissecting every word she said, every movement, every emotion. Normally, shame would follow, self-blame, the familiar thought, I ruined everything. But this time, the spiral stalled, not stopped, just interrupted. And that interruption mattered. This is often how awakening begins, not with clarity, but with disruption. When someone has been psychologically manipulated for a long time, their internal world follows a script that's been carefully written for them. They react the same way every time. They blame themselves the same way every time. Their mind automatically fills in the same conclusions. So when the pattern breaks, even slightly, it's not empowering at first. It's destabilizing. Because if your usual self-blame doesn't arrive on time, your mind starts asking questions it was trained not to ask. She noticed it the next day, too. He hadn't texted. Normally, that would have sent her into a quiet panic, wondering what she'd done wrong, whether he was angry, whether she should reach out first to smooth things over. Instead, she made coffee. She moved through the kitchen slowly, deliberately, like she was testing gravity after a fall. She waited for the familiar urge to check her phone every few minutes. It didn't come. And that's when a thought slipped in. Not loud, not dramatic, but dangerous in its simplicity. Why do I feel calmer when he's not here? She didn't like that thought. It felt disloyal, unfair, almost cruel. After all, hadn't she spent months telling herself that she was the unstable one? That she was the emotional problem? That her anxiety was hers to fix? If that were true, why did her body feel better in his absence? She tried to push the thought away. She reminded herself of all the reasons she'd stayed, the good moments, the charm, the apologies that almost sounded sincere, the way he could be kind when it suited him. But her body didn't respond to logic. Her shoulders stayed relaxed. Her breathing stayed slow. Her mind stayed clearer than it had in a long time. The body often wakes up before the mind does. Long before someone consciously understands that they're being manipulated, their nervous system already knows. The body keeps score of every dismissal, every subtle threat, every emotional withdrawal. And when the source of that stress disappears, even temporarily, the body responds immediately. This isn't imagination, it's biology. And it creates a terrifying contradiction. If the relationship is normal, why does your body only feel safe outside of it? Later that afternoon, he finally texted. A simple message, casual, as if nothing had happened. "Hey, you good?" Just 3 words. Her stomach tightened, not with fear this time, but with recognition. She knew this move, the reset, the unspoken agreement that they would both pretend nothing happened, as long as she didn't bring it up. Her fingers hovered over the screen. Normally, she would have replied instantly. Something light, something reassuring, something that said, "I'm okay. We're okay. Don't worry." Instead, she paused, not to punish him, not to play games, but because she noticed something else. The moment she thought about replying, her chest tightened again. The calm began to fade. She stared at that physical reaction like it was evidence at a crime scene. Interesting, she thought. That's interesting. She didn't reply right away. This is another early sign of awakening. You begin to observe your reactions instead of drowning in them. Instead of immediately acting on anxiety, you start noticing what triggers it. You stop assuming the feeling means something is wrong with you, and you start asking what it might be responding to. This doesn't feel empowering yet. It feels unsettling, because observation creates distance, and distance weakens control. When he finally came over that evening, she saw him differently, not dramatically, not clearly, just differently. He smiled the same way, spoke the same way, used the same tone that always sounded reasonable, measured, calm. He asked about her day like nothing had happened, and for the first time, she noticed how performative it felt. Not fake, calculated, like he was stepping into a role he knew well. She responded carefully, watching herself from the inside, watching how she softened her voice automatically, how she avoided certain words, how she adjusted her expressions to keep things smooth. And suddenly, another thought appeared. Quiet, sharp, impossible to ignore. Why am I managing myself so carefully right now? That question landed harder than all the accusations he'd ever thrown at her. Because she didn't feel this way around other people. She didn't monitor her tone like this with friends. She didn't rehearse sentences in her head with family. She didn't shrink her emotions preemptively in other rooms. Only here, only with him. Awakening often begins with contrast. You don't realize how constrained you are until you notice how free you feel elsewhere. You don't realize how controlled your emotional expression has become until you catch yourself editing yourself in real time. This is not overthinking. This is pattern recognition. And once the pattern becomes visible, it cannot be unseen. That night, lying in bed again, she didn't cry. That scared her more than the tears ever had. Because tears meant release. Tears meant she still believed the story that something was wrong with her. Tears meant she was trying to fix herself to fit a situation that kept hurting her. This quiet felt different. It felt like standing at the edge of something unnamed. She wasn't ready to call it abuse. She wasn't ready to blame him. She wasn't ready to leave. But she was no longer fully inside his version of reality. And that was new. In the next part, something shifts again. Not in her thoughts, but in how she remembers the past. Moments she once dismissed begin to rearrange themselves. Patterns emerge. Contradictions surface. And a question she's avoided for a long time finally begins to take shape. What if this wasn't accidental? She didn't decide to look back. It just started happening. Little moments from the past began surfacing on their own, uninvited, like fragments floating up from deep water. Not the dramatic scenes, the shouting, the crying, the nights she broke down, but the quiet ones. The moments she had dismissed at the time because they felt too small to matter. A comment here, a look there, a pause that lasted just a second too long. She would be doing something ordinary, washing dishes, folding laundry, standing in line at a store, and suddenly her mind would replay a memory she hadn't thought about in months. Not with emotion at first, just observation. She remembered the first time she tried to explain something that hurt her and how he'd listened quietly, nodded, and then said, "I think you're projecting." At the time, she'd felt embarrassed, like she'd revealed too much. She remembered apologizing for misunderstanding him, even though she hadn't misunderstood anything at all. Another memory followed. The time she was excited about something small but important to her, and he responded with a flat, "That's cool," before changing the subject to himself. She remembered the hollow feeling that followed, the way she told herself she was being needy for wanting more enthusiasm. Then another. The night she cried softly instead of raising her voice, hoping that if she stayed calm, he would finally hear her. He had looked at her with visible discomfort and said, "I don't know what you want me to do with this." She had swallowed her tears and told him it was fine. At the time, each moment had felt isolated, easy to explain away, easy to minimize. But now, seen together, they formed something different. A pattern. She felt a tightening in her chest. Not panic, not shame, but recognition. Like when you finally see an image come into focus after staring at a blur for too long. This wasn't random. That thought landed gently, but it carried weight. When awakening begins, memory changes its function. Instead of being a source of self-blame, "What did I do wrong here?" it becomes a source of information. Survivors often remember events clearly all along, but the meaning of those events was distorted by constant invalidation. Once the fog starts to lift, the same memories tell a different story. Not a louder story, a clearer one. She noticed how often her memories ended the same way, with her apologizing, with her adjusting, with her convincing herself that she had expected too much. She tried to think of a time when he had truly sat with her discomfort without deflecting it, minimizing it, or turning it into something about her flaws. She searched carefully, honestly. Nothing came. That realization scared her more than anger ever had. Because anger implies conflict. This felt like absence, an absence of emotional responsibility. She remembered how often he used phrases like, "You're reading into it," or "That's not what I meant," or "You always twist things." At the time, those phrases had felt like corrections. Now they sounded like erasures. Each one erased her experience just enough to make her doubt it. She remembered how calm he always stayed during arguments, how composed, how reasonable, how other people admired his patience. And she remembered how that calmness used to make her feel ashamed of her own emotions. But now, a new question surfaced, one she had never allowed herself to ask before. What if his calmness wasn't emotional maturity, but emotional distance? She sat with that thought for a long time. One of the most confusing aspects of narcissistic manipulation is how healthy it can look on the surface. Calmness, logic, emotional restraint, these traits are often praised. But emotional absence can masquerade as emotional control. Real emotional regulation includes empathy. It includes responsiveness. It includes accountability. Calmness without empathy isn't safety. It's disengagement. And when one person disengages emotionally while the other is still trying to connect, the burden of the relationship shifts entirely onto the one who cares more. She began to see how often he positioned himself as the observer rather than a participant. When she was upset, he analyzed her. When she cried, he evaluated her. When she reacted, he labeled her. He rarely asked, "What did I do that hurt you?" He often asked, "Why are you like this?" That difference mattered. She noticed how conversations followed a familiar arc. She would bring up a feeling. He would deflect or minimize it. She would push a little harder. He would accuse her of being emotional. And eventually, she would break, either into tears or into anger. And then suddenly, The entire conversation became about her reaction. The original issue vanished. She remembered how exhausted she felt afterward, how drained, how confused, how guilty, how she always left those conversations feeling smaller than when she entered them. And for the first time, she wondered, if I were truly the problem, why did these conversations always end with me feeling like I needed to disappear? Manipulation thrives in confusion. When a dynamic consistently leaves one person feeling ashamed, unstable, and unsure of their reality, while the other remains intact, confident, and unquestioned, something is deeply wrong. Healthy conflict may be uncomfortable, but it doesn't systematically dismantle one person's sense of self. This is where awakening deepens, not as certainty, but as suspicion. That night, she did something she had never done before. She opened a note on her phone and began writing. Not emotionally, not dramatically, just plainly. She wrote down things he had said, specific phrases, specific patterns. You're too sensitive. You always make things difficult. I didn't say that. You misunderstood me. Why are you turning this into a problem? Seeing them lined up like that made her stomach drop. Individually, they could be brushed off. Together, they looked like a script. She didn't label it yet. She didn't call it abuse. That word still felt too heavy, too final. But she did allow herself one quiet truth. This dynamic has a structure, and structures don't happen by accident. She put the phone down and stared at the ceiling, the same way she had so many nights before. But this time, instead of replaying everything she had done wrong, she felt something else. Distance. Not emotional detachment. Clarity. She could see the relationship as something outside herself now. Something she was inside of, yes, but not something that defined who she was. That realization didn't bring relief. It brought grief. Because with clarity comes loss. The loss of the illusion that if you just tried harder, loved better, stayed calmer, things would finally change. She realized how much effort she had poured into managing the relationship, how much emotional labor she had done alone, how often she had swallowed herself to keep the peace. And quietly, painfully, she acknowledged something she had avoided for a long time. I have been doing all the work. This stage of awakening is often the most painful, not because of what the survivor learns about the abuser, but because of what they learn about themselves. They see how much they gave, how long they stayed, how deeply they hoped. This isn't self-blame. It's mourning. When he texted her later that night, another casual message, another soft reset, she noticed something else. Her first instinct was no longer fear. It was fatigue. Not the tiredness that comes from a long day, but the kind that settles into your bones when you realize how repetitive something has become. The same cycles, the same conversations, the same outcomes. She replied politely, briefly, and then she put the phone down. The room felt quiet again. Not peaceful, but honest. She wasn't ready to leave. She wasn't ready to confront him. She wasn't ready to name everything yet. But the story she had been telling herself, the one where she was fundamentally broken, unstable, and too much, was starting to unravel. And once a story begins to fall apart, it can never fully be put back together. In the next part, awareness moves from memory to the present. She starts noticing the manipulation as it's happening. The moments don't just make sense in hindsight anymore. They reveal themselves in real time. And with that comes a new kind of fear. What do you do when you see the truth, but aren't ready to act on it yet? The strangest part wasn't remembering the past differently. It was noticing the present more clearly. Once that shift happened, once her mind stopped automatically protecting the relationship, things began to look exposed. Conversations she used to walk away from confused now left her alert. Not reactive, not explosive, just aware. It started with something small. He was talking about his day, about a situation where someone had overreacted at work. He laughed while describing it, shaking his head, explaining how irrational the other person was, how calm he himself had been. She listened quietly, and halfway through his story, she felt it, that familiar tightening in her chest. But this time, instead of blaming herself for it, she noticed it. She watched how his words framed the other person as emotional, unreasonable, unstable, while positioning himself as logical, patient, superior. She had heard this story before. Not this exact story, but the structure. It was the same structure he used with her. And suddenly, without effort, another thought appeared. This is how he talks about people who challenge him. The realization didn't hit like a punch. It settled like a weight. This is a critical stage in awakening. Pattern recognition in real time. Before, she only understood things afterward. Days later, weeks later, when the damage was already done. Now, her nervous system was beginning to connect signals as they happened. This isn't hypervigilance, it's discernment. The difference matters. Hypervigilance comes from fear. Discernment comes from clarity. Later that evening it happened again. She expressed a preference, something simple, almost insignificant. A plan she didn't feel comfortable with. Her voice was calm, measured. There was no accusation in it. He paused, just briefly. Then he smiled. That smile used to reassure her. It looked friendly, relaxed, almost charming. But now she noticed something else beneath it. Distance. A subtle withdrawal. "Well," he said lightly, "you always find a way to make things complicated." There it was. Not shouted, not aggressive, delivered like a joke. Her body reacted instantly. A small drop in her stomach, a subtle tightening in her shoulders. But something else happened too. She didn't scramble to explain herself. She didn't rush to soften her words. She didn't apologize for having a preference. She simply noticed the move. That was a dismissal, she thought. That was a quiet punishment. She said nothing. And that silence changed the energy in the room. When manipulation works, it relies on predictable responses. He says something invalidating. She reacts by explaining, defending, justifying, or apologizing. The cycle continues. But when the response changes, even slightly, the system destabilizes. Silence, hence, doesn't always mean fear. Sometimes it means the mind is no longer playing its assigned role. He looked at her, expecting something. A reaction, a correction, a retreat. When it didn't come, he frowned. "What?" he asked. She shrugged. "Nothing." That single word felt heavier than any argument they'd ever had. Because it wasn't nothing. It was restraint. It was awareness choosing not to perform. She could feel the old impulse rising, the urge to clarify, to smooth things over, to make sure he didn't think she was upset. That urge had been trained into her over time. It came from survival, not weakness. But now she recognized it. And recognition created space. She noticed how often he reframed her silence as a flaw. "You're being distant," he said later. "You're sulking. You're shutting down again." Each accusation was designed to pull her back into the familiar dynamic, where she had to reassure him, explain herself, prove that she wasn't angry or unstable. But this time, she didn't feel the same panic. Instead, she felt something colder. Why does my calm make him uncomfortable? That question lingered. In unhealthy dynamics, the victim's emotional regulation can feel threatening to the manipulator. Why? Because calm awareness removes leverage. When she stops reacting the way she used to, he loses the contrast that made him look reasonable. He loses the emotional chaos that distracted from his behavior. He loses the control that came from managing her responses. This is why awakening can provoke subtle escalations. She began to notice those escalations, small comments that landed sharper than before. jokes that carried an edge, moments where he tested boundaries just to see if she'd react. When she didn't, he became slightly colder, not overtly cruel, just distant enough to remind her of what she stood to lose. She recognized this pattern too: affection used as currency, warmth withdrawn as punishment. Before, that withdrawal had sent her spiraling inward. Now she simply felt sad, not devastated, sad. And sadness is different from panic. Sadness allows thinking. One evening, after a quiet dinner, he said something that used to devastate her. "I don't know why you're like this," he said casually. "Other people don't react the way you do." Normally, that sentence would have cracked her open. She would have replayed it for days, wondering what was wrong with her, why she couldn't be normal. This time, her mind responded differently. Other people aren't in this relationship, she thought. The realization was so simple it almost startled her. This is a pivotal internal shift, contextual thinking. Instead of seeing her reactions as proof of a personal flaw, she begins to see them as responses to a specific environment. This doesn't mean she feels strong yet. It means she feels grounded. Grounding is dangerous to manipulation. That night, lying in bed, she felt the familiar urge to replay everything. But the loop didn't tighten the way it used to. The questions had changed. Not, "What's wrong with me?" but "Why does this dynamic require me to disappear to function?" That question didn't demand an answer yet. It simply existed, and its presence altered everything. She realized she had been living in a state of constant self-surveillance, monitoring her tone, her words, her emotions, while he moved freely, unchecked, unquestioned. She realized how one-sided that balance was. And slowly, painfully, another truth emerged. This relationship only works when I am small. She felt grief again. Not explosive grief. Quiet grief. Grief for the version of herself who believed love required self-erasure. Grief for the energy she had spent trying to be less so things could be better. But grief, unlike shame, doesn't collapse the self. It honors it. She wasn't ready to leave. She wasn't ready to confront him. She still doubted herself, still had moments where his words echoed louder than her own thoughts. But now, when he spoke, there was a delay, a pause between stimulus and response. And in that pause lived something new: choice. Awakening is not action. It is preparation. It creates space between who you were forced to be and who you actually are. It doesn't solve the problem immediately. It changes how the problem is held inside the mind. And once that space exists, the old dynamic can no longer operate the same way. She drifted to sleep that night with a strange mix of fear and clarity. Fear, because seeing the truth meant she could no longer hide from it. Clarity, because for the first time she trusted her internal experience more than his explanation of it. That trust was fragile, but it was real, and it was growing. In the final part, awakening reaches its quiet conclusion, not with confrontation or escape, but with a deep internal decision. A line drawn, not out loud, but within. A moment where she understands something essential, even if nothing changes yet. I see it now, and that changes everything. She didn't announce it. She didn't say anything out loud. There was no confrontation, no dramatic ending, no final speech. The shift happened quietly. One morning she woke up and noticed the familiar weight in her chest wasn't there yet. Not because things were better, but because nothing had happened yet. No words spoken, no tone to decode, no emotional test to pass. And for the first time she realized something unsettling. Peace shouldn't depend on silence. That thought stayed with her as the day unfolded. She moved through ordinary moments, making coffee, answering messages, stepping outside, while something inside her continued to rearrange itself. Not quickly, not cleanly, but decisively. She noticed how often she used to wake up already bracing herself, how her body had learned to expect impact before it arrived, how calm had only existed in the absence of him. And then she noticed something else. Even when he was around now, the impact wasn't landing the same way. His words still carried weight, but they no longer defined the entire room. There was space between what he said and what she believed. That space mattered. This is the quiet end of awakening. Internal separation. Not leaving yet, not resisting loudly, but no longer fusing your identity to someone else's perception of you. Psychologically, this is the moment when the victim stops outsourcing reality. They still feel fear, they still feel doubt, but they also feel something else for the first time in a long time. Ownership. Later that day, he made another comment, a familiar one. "You're overthinking again," he said, almost kindly. "You should really stop doing that." She felt the reflex rise, the old urge to explain herself, to defend her thoughts, to prove she wasn't too much. But instead of acting on it, she paused. And in that pause, she asked herself a different question. What happens if I don't correct him? The answer came immediately. Nothing happened. The world didn't collapse. He didn't leave. She didn't disappear. The silence stretched between them, not tense, not explosive, just present. And she realized something simple and devastating. So much of her emotional exhaustion had come not from conflict, but from constant self-correction. Manipulative dynamics rely on constant engagement, explaining, defending, justifying, apologizing. When that engagement stops, even internally, the dynamic weakens. Not because the manipulator changes, but because the victim no longer participates in the distortion. This isn't strength yet. It's alignment. That night, she sat alone again. But this time, the quiet didn't feel like waiting. It felt like listening. To herself, not for him. She thought about the woman she had been before this relationship. Not idealized. Not perfect. Just intact. She hadn't been fearless. She hadn't been silent. But she had trusted her reactions. Somewhere along the way, that trust had been replaced by constant doubt. Doubt planted slowly, reinforced subtly, until it felt like truth. Now, piece by piece, that doubt was losing its authority. She didn't suddenly forgive herself. She didn't suddenly feel proud. But she stopped calling herself broken, and that mattered more than anything else. Healing does not begin with empowerment slogans or bold decisions. It begins when shame loosens its grip. When the question shifts from, "What's wrong with me?" to "What happened to me?" That shift changes the entire nervous system. She understood now why leaving felt impossible before. You can't leave a place when you still believe you're the problem. You can't walk away from something when you think it's your job to fix yourself to fit it. Awakening doesn't tell you what to do next. It tells you who you are not. And that alone is enough to begin. She still had moments of doubt. Moments where his voice echoed louder than her own. Moments where she wondered if she was exaggerating, remembering wrong, being unfair. But those moments didn't own her anymore. They passed. And she let them pass. If you're listening to this and something inside you feels uncomfortably familiar, if you've noticed that your body only relaxes when a certain person is gone, if you've ever been told you're too emotional, too sensitive, or too much, and yet somehow you only feel that way in one specific place, pause. Stay here for a moment. You don't need to decide anything today. You don't need to label your relationship. You don't need to confront anyone. But you do need to listen to what your body has been trying to tell you. If this series has put words to something you felt but couldn't explain, if it helped you see your experience with even a little more clarity, stay with this conversation. There is more to understand, more layers to unpack, more healing that begins not with action, but with truth. And if you know someone who is still trapped in confusion, still blaming themselves, still wondering why they changed, this story might help them feel less alone. She didn't know what the future would look like yet. She didn't know when or how things would change, But she knew this: she would never again accept a version of herself that only existed to make someone else comfortable. That line, drawn quietly, internally, was permanent. Awakening isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand applause. It simply refuses to go back to sleep. And once you see the pattern, once you trust your internal experience again, once you understand that your breakdown was not weakness, but a response, the story can never be told the same way again. Not by them, and not by you. This is not the end of the journey, but it is the end of believing you were the problem, and that is where everything truly begins.